Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's a Tuesday here in the upper Midwest. I wasn't planning on doing an episode today. I feel like my last one's still pretty fresh. But sometimes epiphanies and kind of thoughts come to you that are like, well, I might as well just catch this in the bottle now while it's stirring about in my brain. I hope everybody's doing well out there. I'm down 20 pounds now since January. It's about a pound a week from playing basketball 3 times a week. And get to the point where I can actually kind of run the floor. I'm not sprinting, but I'm a good steady canter, I guess I could say. It feels good, the joints, everything, just big difference. But it's just nice to be part of that community again, having people to fellowship with. The gym is an interesting place to talk to people. I get a lot of good dialogue there, and I think it's going to dovetail nicely into the coffee shop, which we had a meeting with that on last Friday, and then we're going to present to a board that will potentially fund the remaining gap of what we need. So say a prayer and cross a finger and whatever else mystical mythology you adhere to, because we'd appreciate all those positive thoughts that exist. And it's funny, when we need something, we want to believe in some higher power. That's the humility of old age and not knowing it all. I certainly once knew it all when I was 17, 18. Had some experience with my stepkids that are now that age. They certainly have a high degree of intellect and are devoid of hindsight or mistake making, which is a good thing, thankfully. I hope the sarcasm in that rang out. Moving on. The epiphany, the thought, the realization is there's something about the great jazz age that I've always kind of seen it and I've talked about it, but it hit me kind of with a clarity today. And I've been going through a lot of the Norman Granz Verve catalog lately, and I plan on doing an episode on him in the future, and not in the near future. I'm working on it right now. I'm kind of building pieces and blocks and how I want to present, and it's a pretty comprehensive guy. He has a pretty deep imprint on the body of jazz. It's a bit like a Creed Taylor or John Hammond. It's not a story you can tell with one song and dance. There's elements to it you have to kind of be willing to cover and explore. But I was sitting in my mind, just kind of quantifying what Norman Granz did. And it's such an incredible, broad achievement that on some level, that roster of artists from Ella and Billy and Parker and Dizzy through to Ray and Oscar and Sweets and Eldridge, Ben Webster, Coleman Hawkins. It's just so many important Count Basie stalwarts of the music that he preserved for posterity. He preserved them for the future to see, almost as a piece of amber encases a bug. He encased the black jazz musician in the late 40s and early 50s. And again, we'll get more into the Norman Granz angle about when we talk about Norman. But in my mind, I'm getting to a place where that accomplishment, that achievement, that collection of music might be the single greatest accretion of jazz recordings from any label. And even without this epiphany, Verve's in the top 2-3 without question. There's no doubt. There's no question the Creed Taylor era of Verve, which I came to first. It's been re-commercialized. It was re-hip-ified in the 2000s. Bands like Thievery Corp, one of my favorite groups out of DC, remixed and put it out there in a loungy kind of way and exposed the whole era of Verve, Creed Taylor coolness, hipness, that American living room picture book jacket, lounging cocktail music, never too political, social, or aggressive. Creed Taylor certainly repackaged the Verve sound, but it's part of the Verve legacy all the same. And so if you kind of put that Creed Taylor era with the body of work of what Norman Granz and what his era accomplished, including at Norgran and Clef, which again all got issued on the Verve label anyway. And remember, Norman was also leasing stuff to Mercury in the late 40s and early 50s, and a few other small labels as well, Stinson, a couple others. But that stuff that got leased to Mercury, he somehow retained ownership of it. Clever on his part. And again, we'll delve more into the Norman Granz part of things when we talk about his episode. But the Verve body of work is really impressive, especially that Clef Norgran, late 40s, early 50s. He doesn't really capture bebop, even though bebop's kind of happening. And there's recordings that certainly dip their toes, but they're not the preeminent bebop recordings by most of these guys. It's mostly small group, setting the table for the modern era of jazz. The large swing bands are really not financially feasible anymore, and so this dissolution of those great bands left a lot of really talented guys kind of jobless in a way. And Norman creates the jazz at the Philharmonic, employs and records so many giants. Hank Jones, I was just listening to a Hank Jones 10-inch this morning. This was issued to Mercury, early Hank Jones. I think it was Clef 100, which might make it the first 10-inch in the Clef canon. So anyway, I was just looking at the body of work of Verve and just thinking about the dynamic and the impact and the importance of it. And I would have to say the other candidate is really Blue Note. And Blue Note for all the reasons I've said infinite times. That honesty, that impactfulness, that militancy, that new aggressive tone of the civil rights era. As those steps and tracks were being laid, these Blue Note hard boppers were really at the foreground of black music in the 50s. And people who talk about jazz music in the 60s, 70s, that's no longer the foreground of black music. This is the last gasp of black music and jazz being the same thing. By the time the mid-50s, late 50s, and then the 60s comes along, rhythm and blues, early rock and roll, which were synonymous really at that time, was taking foot. And all the young black musicians were going there. And then as civil rights comes about, the message of jazz, socially and culturally, is now spoken through microphones by these new post-civil rights R&B guys. So the message of the black community is no longer spoken to the same degree and for as much of the black community as it was by this last gasp of black youth that were born in the 20s and 30s, were becoming of men in the late 40s, early 50s. Almost all of them served in the Army and Navy and came back to still a nation that was not granting them freedom that they were willing to die for. And so that war and the fact that so many black young men served, you could have been a well-established musician and still gone out. And that happened to white musicians as well, but far less so. I mean, I would say maybe 50% of the white cats that I've done research on over the years, like, oh, he ended up in the service. And all those guys served behind the lines. And a lot of the black guys did too. A lot of the black guys got into bands, actually, to entertain the troops behind the lines in Europe and in England, which preserves a lot of their lives, thankfully. But that militancy of that Blue Note stuff, that intensity of that expression via the improvisation and emoting process that is the art form of jazz. That's a magical thing I just said. I put it really succinctly in a nice series of words. It's a little train of nice words put together to sum up what jazz is. But as important as that is, and as dynamic and as revelatory and as inspirational as that music of resistance is, it's only further magnified and impacted by the refined elegance and sophistication of the Norman Granz era jazz giants. That's a part of the equation. If you don't understand that elegant refinement of Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins, Sweets Edison, if you don't understand how wonderfully cultured and well-dressed and self-representing for themselves as individuals, but for their people and their race as well. This was a class of men you could not really find a rival in many walks of life. You take the average Major League Baseball team at this point, they were a bunch of tobacco-spitting, alcoholic, racist pigs. These Norman Granz jazz men came up, lived through the Depression, lived through Jim Crow. Most of these guys were born in the South because the black migration of the 30s and 40s into the 50s and 60s is still taking place. And that's something these trading cards has really driven home in the geography of the black man in America. And boy, I'm talking South Africa level segregation and pushed into townships kind of level stuff. They only come from a few places, these black men in America. And in the 20s and the 30s and the teens and the 10s, these guys came from even less places. They were mostly from the South. Mostly from the South. And so most of the guys that came up in the music in the 30s, in the 20s, were Southern, raised in that incredible divide. But it taught them to handle themselves with a certain amount of class, a certain amount of dignity, even a certain amount of respect for the authority that overruled them, because it was through respect and dignity that they attempted to make the progress of achieving equality. So it's the elegance and the refinement of these incredibly talented black men that Norman Granz had brought together that spoke of the highest level of our sophistication as a people. We're presenting ourselves in the finest of suits, with the finest of leather shoes. I got my pork pie hat. I have a fine instrument. We're going to play in the finest concert halls. The finest you got, white America. We're going to play in Carnegie. We're going to strip and rip the walls down because that's how we play. But we're always going to carry ourselves as gentlemen, as men of class, dignity. Not militancy, dignity. We were champions of our people by showing how educated and sophisticated and responsible and able to live amongst y'all in forgiveness and harmony. And yet the indignity was still spat upon them, as Billie Holiday was told, go ride in that freight elevator. And I'm guessing there was an N-word attached to that. So it's in the dignity and the respect and the sheer elegance of the Norman Granz era men and those recordings that the magnification and realization of the militancy and the anger of the Blue Note hardboppers can be truly revealed and seen. It's a great contrast. It's of great note when you recognize that it's the determined effort by the generation that Granz houses to attain acceptance in America through forgiveness and class and elegance and refinement and dressing suave and debonair and being classy citizens who paid their taxes. They did everything right. These young men came up after the Bassies and the Ellingtons, the Websters and the Hawkins. These young black men came up in America, were forced into the service to fight for the freedom of other white people. were treated like messengers of peace in Europe. They were treated really well, which further alienated them from the reality of what was waiting for them back home in America, and made it more difficult for them to accept that situation. So it's only in the place that generation that Norman Granz has, and the level and effort that they took and showed to the country, it's only in the denial of that being effective that the attitudes of that new generation can blossom into that aggression, dissatisfaction, and need for change and militancy, because you've left us no choice. They tried everything they could to bridge that gap. Listen to the recordings they made. They're still played in our museums and art galleries today. Let that sink in. The music of Norman Granz and those men, that stuff from Clef, Verve, Norman, that is institutionalized and ingrained into the Smithsonian-like history of this country. And you can hear it in cafes and coffee shops and libraries, museums, and art galleries across the country, because that's some of the most sophisticated art that America's ever created. So it goes step, hand lock, footprint. It's there with everything else that's happened. And it's achieved a high acceptance in the art community of a high level of intelligence and a high level of sophistication and a high level of cultural importance. And yet to the average American, they still spit on that. They still spit on that. Doesn't mean shit to me. I could completely ignore that and wash my hands of that, because my reality is different. I got myself a gun. I know that they're coming for me because of what we did to them for centuries. Can't blame you for thinking it, but it never has really happened. It's been a pretty accepting, forgiving black community in America. The atrocities are pretty one-sided in who is carrying out atrocities against who. It's always shocked me as a Canadian how it's still a white man dragging a black man to his death behind a pickup truck. Where's the stories of the reverse? Where's the black man rising up and burning white body? It hasn't really happened. It's white hate and fury and rage and insecurity and emasculation that fuels racism of that nature still to this day. And there was no recognition on the part of many Southern whites and even a lot of white Northern whites of the achievement and accomplishment of this great black community of jazz musicians. And so a young Lee Morgan, a young even John Coltrane, they have to recognize that tolerance, forgiveness, behaving with class and dignity is not enough. Didn't get us there. Behaving with elegance and refinement, that should have been the door we walked through to allow them to accept us into their society. Look at my shoes. I got on silk socks. Smell my cologne. These black men put together some of the most refined, elegant looks in the 20th century that people still imitate. It's an incredible accomplishment that made little impact in the overall overreaching acceptance and integration of black men in America. And so from that perspective, it only enhances the militancy, tempos, and aggression and expression of the hard boppers. And hard bop is linked to this music. It's not like they're separate things that are being done differently. Hard bop is kind of this modern jazz at high tempos with some of the elements of bebop as well. But hard bop refers back to the blues and song structure and stating melody and having a head of the chorus, so we know exactly what song we're killing, going down on. We're throwing down on this. But you guys know it's that. We're going to make sure you guys know what song we're playing. So the melody can be in your head. You can hum along. I'm not going to verbatim play the words. But since you know the words, it's going to make what I play that much more interesting, because you're like, wow, look at all the things he's adding. Harmonically, rhythmically, the pulse, the tonality, the dynamics of it. Knowing the words to a song and hearing a soloist play that lyric and enhancing it and changing it and shifting it and redoing it, that's part of the magic of bebop and hard bop. And if you don't know the American Songbook, a lot of that is lost on us. But the average American in those days all knew those songs. So when they heard Clifford Brown do Cherokee, they're like, oh, man, never imagined you could remix that like that. Every American knew the songbook, the stuff from the theaters and the stages. So these songs were so omnipresent that when John Coltrane does My Favorite Things, everyone was like, never thought of that kind of a remix sound, which was a lot of what jazz was doing, was remixing popular music to make it sexual and pulsable and danceable, which is what house and techno DJs still do today. They remix a song by Adele so people can dance to it. Put a groove beat under it. Same thing. And so it's the refusal of America in general to accept the great swing era giants, as Norman Granz was presenting them at the Philharmonic and bringing them around the country and playing with an integrated band and seeing still the resistance of the Republic. It's that fuels that next generation to say no more. You know what I mean? You rejected my elders in spite of all their years of sacrifice and in spite of centuries of tyranny. I served in your wars to come home to ghettos being torn apart by your new freeways that are further isolating us from the rest of the country. Like, let's not forget that. The U.S. Freeway Act goes into place, Eisenhower, and they're starting building these new neighborhoods, or tearing apart neighborhoods, really, with the installation of these multi-lane, massive freeways through all of our urban cores. And what it did time after time after time was slice through the edge of white neighborhoods and take black neighborhoods and then cut those black neighborhoods off that was left from the white neighborhoods. That's how you built a highway in America in 1950. You want to push through some eminent domain? Well, we're going to take a bunch of black neighborhoods, level them. We're going to flatten them. Pittsburgh Hillside kind of district, boom, gone. And they're going to have to go somewhere else or move in with their cousins here on what we leave, but they're going to be surrounded by freeway on three sides and a river on the other. And now business opportunities are diminished. The ability to take transit out of those neighborhoods into other neighborhoods to find employment are diminished. The ability for white consumers to come into black-owned businesses and help support those businesses is also diminished. I could have gone to that old market I used to go to, run by that black couple I loved, but now it's all the way on the other side of those freeways and those off-ramps and all that concrete, and it just further dissolves the fabric and prevents anything from grafting itself together. Disco got thrown out by the Republicans in the 80s because it was forcing an integration in the bedroom that scared a lot of white Americans. The purity of the white legacy, which is so laughable because you were all black once upon a time. We've all been immigrating and migrating and breeding with each other through war and pillage, through migration. There's just no such thing as a human purity aside from being human. So this notion of racial divide, it's so artificially done to preserve economic institutions. But this is all very clear and evident for this young generation of black musicians who were getting educated better for the first time because of the black migration. A lot of these young cats weren't coming out of Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. They were now coming out of Detroit and Chicago. They had gone to black universities or state-run universities that had education that was far superior to what their elders had in most cases. But that also gave them an understanding of their freedoms as guaranteed to them by the Constitution of this country. It made them understand of the freedoms and promises being denied them and their people. And they saw the elegance and refinement of their grandfathers and their fathers, and yet they still got spit in their face and slapped and brought down to their knees. And it took a giant like Norman Granz to get out there and emissate for them, to give them any kind of recognition as they went into the starlight years of their lives. I mean, the diminished later years, they're still getting some recognition because of a guy like Norman Granz. So when you compare the greatest body of work by any label, and there's many labels that have made great contributions to the music, and few of them are multi-generational, like a Columbia was, where many different eras of the music are preserved on that label. But Columbia also bought up a lot of small things and made them become Columbia recordings when they weren't necessarily to start off with. But you have those early 40s labels like Keynote and Commodore that were doing good independent things. A lot of it on the 78, a lot of it was being done live and on small budgets, and the big labels are kind of documenting the safer things. But then Norman Granz comes along and really changes things and gives a well-paying job to these guys. And again, Verve paid probably 3-4 times what Blue Note could pay a guy. And that's also further evidence of why the Blue Note kids were all young kids that a Blue Note guy could afford to sign. Blue Note couldn't probably afford to compete with Norman Granz to hire a Ray Brown, one of the greatest bass players of all time. He was already getting paid pretty good working for Norman. So a guy like Alfred Lyon, he's looking for that young, undiscovered talent. So some of the greatest talent scouts with those small little black labels, looking for the young, new talent in Newark and in New Jersey and up in, the circle of musicians from New York is just insane. I can't believe how many New York musicians there are. And a lot of the big names proliferate across the country, but a lot of the backbone of a lot of these bands, they're New York guys, New York raised. It's amazing. I think Chicago and Detroit in my trading cards have about 40 guys so far, each of them that are from Detroit area, Chicago area. Philadelphia's maybe 50. I think New York's near 100 or more already. And I still got 200 cards to go to finish up. So it's pretty interesting to see how limited where the black men come from and how it changes over time. But when you compare the Blue Note legacy, which is so important, it's such an important chapter of the American story, let's not forget the part of that potency, part of that litmus test, part of what makes it so dynamic is in comparing it and reflecting to what the generation before them were doing for Norman Granz, and how the elegance and refinement of all those men wasn't enough. And so we're going to go from this to this with the raised fist of defiance. And civil rights was forced upon us by a determined group of people no longer willing to live in the land of the free, unfree. Hope you enjoy the channel. Sometimes when inspiration hits, you just gotta let it go. I think that was a fun episode. I enjoyed that. So what's your thought? Is it that Norman Granz body of work, or is it that Blue Note canon? Of course, the Blue Note canon has more oomph and commercial appeal today, but it's hard to argue that the two really reveal a lot about the others. They really do. And when you talk Blue Note, you can really add Prestige and Riverside and even Savoy into that mix. They're very interchangeable. They all use Reeve and Gelder. They use a lot of the same musicians and sidemen. It was a very close-knit community in New York and New Jersey area. Atlantic's a bit more on the sideline in that dimension. Bethlehem was its own universe. But so there's just a lot of great labels. Argo in Chicago, Emerson was doing incredible things. But when you look at that overall reaching impact of the body of work, Verve is probably easily 1,000 albums. There's probably 800 plus just in the 8,000 series alone. There's the 2,000, the 4,000 series. There's Clef and Norgran stuff that might have been omitted by the Verve reissues. It's a pretty immense body of work by, again, an all-star roster of Hall of Fame jazz players. The Blue Note Cats are much more reflected upon now as Hall of Famers, but they weren't that way in their careers, very few of them. And so it's, again, I think coupled together, both of their impacts are revealed far more. But I might have to at this point say the edge goes to Norman Granz just for the sheer volume and the listenability and accessibility of all that stuff. I mean, all that Ella Fitzgerald stuff, Billie Holiday stuff, so much incredible music that does show up in film and theater and our art galleries, and it's actually more lionized in a way than the Blue Note stuff is. The Blue Note stuff does have a finite audience. You're not going to ever really find Blue Note being played in certain situations, in certain groups. That Verve stuff is innocuous and as much a part of the American story now that even an off-color group of Southerners probably wouldn't raise an eyelid hearing some Ella Fitzgerald playing, because it's become so omnipresent. Louis Armstrong's become so omnipresent. He recorded for Norman some. So it's a pretty important part of the American story. And the prices don't reflect that importance, partly because they sold much better, so there's much more of it out there. But you could make a case that the Norman Granz era Verve catalog entirely, even with the Creed Taylor years, is probably the most important jazz label in jazz history, with Blue Note being a very close second, with their 400 LPs and 70s, 110 inches. You know, there's some 78 stuff, but most of it's all got regurgitated in other formats. And the Blue Note name continues after the Liberty United Artists sales. But when I define Blue Note, I'm defining Blue Note under the steam and engine of Alfred and Frank up to 67. So that's today's episode. Y'all be safe. If you enjoy the channel, please subscribe, hit the like button. It always helps my algorithms from what they tell me. If you want to support the channel, go to Patreon, pledge a few dollars a month. It's always helpful. It helps keeping my wife believe that this is a worthy endeavor, that I should continue to be putting as much effort and time into this as I am. So that's always appreciated. To all y'all's new Patreons, thank you very much, guys. Appreciate it. And we'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.